I had meticulously crafted this life with precision. 9 years of marriage meticulously curated into a picture of suburban success, and our home was immaculate, the kind of house that begged to be photographed for a magazine. Mornings were for Pilates and coffee, afternoons were for running errands, and evenings were for making dinner. James, my husband, worked long hours at his firm, so the rhythm of my days fell into my hands. Gratifying, but lately I felt as though I was stuck inside a snow globe, watching myself go through the motions from the outside. Our daughter Sophie, who turned 7 recently, was a lively, bright child who could light up any room with her laughter. However, lately, even her giggles couldn't lift the weight that seemed to descend on me like a shroud. Losing my father had been an unexpected blow because he had always been my emotional anchor and the only person who understood me, even when I couldn't find the right words. When James told me that he had invited a few friends over for drinks one Friday night, I didn't think much of it because he rarely entertained at home, so I assumed it would be a quiet evening with a few beers, some laughter, and some practical things. However, James tried to help him with the funeral arrangements and legal paperwork, but there was a part of me that he couldn't reach, and I wasn't sure how to show him where to find it. James had suffered a sudden heart attack during his morning run, and ever since I had felt adrift, the grief had hollowed me out. James was in his element, hosting with effortless charm and his steady presence commanding the room. Sophie was already asleep when the doorbell rang and the low murmur of voices began drifting from the living room. I busied myself in the kitchen, allowing the sound of male laughter to fill the silence that had grown so familiar. When I finally entered the living room with a tray of snacks, I paused and noticed Mike leaning back in one of our armchairs. The man in front of me wasn't exactly what I had imagined. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was something magnetic about him, a confidence that bordered on reckless. His voice was rich, his laugh contagious, and unlike the other men in the room, he seemed completely at ease, as if he were a friend of James's from college. He was relaxed, with a bottle of beer dangling from his fingers and his eyes a sharp contrast to his easy smile flicking toward me as I entered. As the evening went on, I found myself drawn into the conversation despite myself. James and his friends reminisced about their college days, sharing jokes and stories that had long since been forgotten. He had been born to take up space, and we exchanged polite pleasantries, but something in the way his eyes lingered on mine made me feel unbalanced. Later, for a brief moment, I caught him looking at me again, his gaze sweeping over me like a gentle touch. I flushed and turned away, embarrassed by the spark of awareness that flared inside me. Mike was the one who kept drawing me in when James and the others started talking about work. He leaned toward me and said, "You look like you could use a break from all this corporate talk," with a low voice. His smile disarming me, I smiled, surprised at how easily the words came. "It's not exactly my area of expertise," he said, laughing. "What is the question?" caught me off guard. When James's friends started to depart, I felt a strange mixture of relief and regret because Mike was the last to leave. He lingered in the doorway as he shook James's hand. His eyes found mine one last time, and I felt the air between us shift. It was nothing more than a fleeting glance, but it stayed with me long after the door had closed. I stammered out a response about interior design and yoga, but Mike listened as though he was simply explaining the theory of relativity. When I lay in bed with James that night, the familiar sound of his steady breathing filled the room. I stared at the ceiling, and my thoughts returned to Mike, not his words or face, but the way he made me feel heard. It wasn't until I turned to James and saw the faint glow of his phone screen as he read some work emails that I realized I was starving for. "Did you have fun tonight?" I asked softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah," he replied without looking up. It was good to see Mike again, been too. I wanted to tell him about the gap that had been widening between us and how his steadiness sometimes felt more like distance, but the words caught in my throat and I turned away instead. That night, somewhere in the dark, I realized that I wasn't just restless. I was looking for something that I didn't even have a name for yet, and for reasons I couldn't fully understand. Long's words were warm, but his attention was elsewhere, his focus already back on the world outside our little bubble. On a typical Tuesday afternoon, as I was unloading groceries from my car's trunk, my hands were full and my phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly let it go to voicemail because the number flashing on the screen was unfamiliar, and I didn't have much patience for spam calls, but something forced me to swipe WIP to answer, pressing the phone between my shoulder and ear while juggling a heavy bag of apples. "Hello," I said, diverting Clara's attention. "I found a number on that thrift site you mentioned in passing, and I thought I'd reach out." His words surprised me not because they felt inappropriate, but because they didn't. His tone wasn't flirtatious or presumptuous. If anything, he sounded almost shy. "Yes, this is Clara." I scowled, squinting against the sun. "Who's this?" "Mike from the other night at James's gathering." He paused as if gauging my reaction. "I hope this isn't strange." I stood frozen for a moment, caught between skepticism and a strange warmth. It was such a considerate gesture, one that James had never considered. Not because he didn't care, but because he would never consider grief as something to discuss. He hesitated, then went on. "I remembered what you said about your dad, and I thought maybe I could share some resources with you. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who gets it. It's difficult to know where to begin, isn't it? But if you ever feel like talking, I'm here, no pressure." His words felt strangely disarming, like someone opening a door I didn't realize had been locked. Our first few conversations were light, meandering through safe topics like hobbies, and that's a really nice gesture of yours. I said, my voice softer now, and I appreciate it. It's been difficult, and I guess I don't talk about it as much as I should. He told me about his mother, who fought cancer for years before dying when he was only 23. He said during one of our early calls that losing her felt like having the ground pulled out from under me for a while, and I didn't even want to get back up. I understood that feeling all too well. "How did you handle it?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter Sophie's favorite books before slipping into the heavier terrain of grief. Mike had a way of making difficult topics feel manageable, his warmth softening the edges of my pain. Most of the time, he admitted that there were coloring books on the table behind me, but there were also people who allowed you to carry them around without asking you to put them down. Does that make sense? It did more than I wanted to admit, but I whispered that it did. Over the course of the weeks, our conversations changed from grief to life, and Mike spoke with a passion that left me feeling both inspired and uneasy. He said, "One evening I used to live by the rules, do the right thing, follow the plan, all that crap, and it left me." His words stuck with me long after the call ended, and I found myself replaying them in my head, wondering when I'd stopped living and started surviving. My days had become a blur of responsibilities and responsibilities, a treadmill of predictability. I loved Sophie, of course. I'm miserable now, so I just try to focus on what makes me feel alive. The sound rich and unguarded, hiking, playing music, taking risks, and he laughed. One evening after a particularly difficult day, I found myself at the cafe I frequently visited whenever the walls of my house felt too close. It was my sanctuary, a small, dimly lit space where the hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine drowned out the noise in my head. I sat by the window, staring out at the street lights as it rained, and I loved James in the way you love. My favorite chair was steady, reliable, and always there, but I couldn't ignore the growing ache inside me that something essential was missing. Traced delicate patterns down the glass, my tea sat untouched, the steam curling in lazy spirals. My phone buzzed on the table, and Mike's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. I wasn't in the mood to talk, not even to him. I didn't hear the door open or the footsteps approaching, but when he spoke, his voice broke through the mental fog. "Clara." I turned in surprise to see Mike standing there, his coat damp from the rain, looking hesitant as though he wasn't sure he belonged, and he admitted slipping into the chair across from me, but I had a feeling, so I blinked and jumbled my thoughts, wondering how he knew you had mentioned it. He shrugged and said, "I like this place when you need to clear your head, so I thought maybe I could keep you company for a moment." I wasn't sure what to say, and his presence felt both intrusive and comforting at the same time. It had been a difficult day. When I finally said it, Mike nodded, his expression gentle, wanting to talk about it, and then the dam broke. I told him everything how. At one point, the distance between us seemed to close. His hand touched mine as he reached for his coffee, and I didn't pull away because the warmth of his skin felt like an anchor tying me to a moment I wasn't ready to leave. I felt like I was drowning in routine. James' steadiness had turned into a wall I couldn't scale. Grief had hollowed me out and left me searching for something I couldn't name. Mike listened to his steady and unwavering gaze. His presence grounded me in a way I hadn't realized I needed at one point. Mike said softly, his forehead resting against mine, and I couldn't help but not respond because my thoughts were too tangled and my emotions were too raw. All I knew was that something had changed, and there was no turning back when I finally pulled away the space between us. It was a brief, tentative meeting of lips that held more questions than answers. It wasn't dramatic or desperate, just soft and searching like the brush of a breeze. But it left me breathless and my heart racing, as though I'd crossed some invisible line I shouldn't have done that. I realized that I didn't know what I was walking toward or away from, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. The guilt from that kiss lingered in my chest like a heavy stone, appearing in Sophie's laughter and in the faint smile James would give me as he kissed my forehead before work. I felt heavy with unspoken things, so I whispered, trembling, and Mike nodded his eyes, searching mine. "Take care of yourself, Clara." When James mentioned his upcoming 3-day business trip, the idea of inviting Mika over came as a surprise. It was reckless, yes, but I told myself it was just dinner, a way to test my emotions and understand what I was feeling. I told myself it was a mistake, a crack in my otherwise careful life, but deep down I knew it was more than that. There was a thrill beneath the guilt, a pulse of something I hadn't felt in years, not just for Mike, but for the way he made me feel alive and untethered, because I was craving something I couldn't name. "Keep everything under control." I texted Mike with my heart pounding in my chest, and he responded quickly. I'd love to know how much time I spent preparing, alternating between excitement and panic. By the time the bell rang that evening, I had already resigned myself to oblivion, but he was standing on my doorstep with that familiar smile and a bottle of wine. "Hey," he said warmly, "thought I'd bring something to the table." "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike said in a light but uncertain tone, "I hope it's okay. I had bumped into these guys earlier, and well, one thing led to another." I wanted to say that it wasn't okay that I'd only planned for 2, but the words caught in my throat, so I forced a smile and stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Of course, the more the merrier, I said, the more my heart pounded for completely different reasons. Brad was tall and broad-shouldered, with a boyish charm that made him seem younger than he probably was. Tom, the oldest of the group, had silver streaks in his dark hair, a commanding presence, a deep resonant laugh, and a way of speaking that made you feel like he was letting you in on a secret. Their voices filled the living room with laughter and easy camaraderie. I found myself watching them, studying the way each of them carried themselves, the energy they brought into the room. Aaron, the quiet one, who sat back in his chair with an easy confidence, had a quick wit and a mischievous grin that seemed to linger whenever his eyes landed on me. He wasn't as talkative as the others, but his eyes had a sharpness and intensity that made me feel as though he saw right through me. Mike was different, but he was the reason I had agreed to this evening. He seemed content to let the others dominate the conversation, watching me with a steady gaze, his presence less overt but no less. I poured a lot of wine in the hopes that the alcohol would ease my uneasiness, but as the evening went on, the atmosphere changed, the laughter increased, the banter became more playful, and then it started to take on a sharper edge, something more charged. "You've outdone yourself," Clara, Tom said, raising his glass in a toast, his eyes lingering on mine, warm and grateful. "I'll say," Brad added with a smile, "and if James were here, I would be telling him that he's the luckiest man alive." As I refilled glasses and cleared plates, Aaron, who had been sitting quietly, chuckled softly. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use." The other two laughed, but I felt a flush creep up my neck. I forced a smile, brushing aside their remarks with a light laugh, but I could feel the weight of their attention as I refilled glasses and cleared plates. "You've got an eye for this kind of thing," Tom said, pointing to the carefully arranged table, "but I guess you've got an eye for everything, don't you?" Brad leaned back in. Brad hovered near the kitchen with his glass in hand, and Tom and Aaron were deep in conversation about something work-related. The alcohol emboldened them, but it also stripped me of my usual defenses. I laughed along, pretending their words didn't affect me, even as my heart raced. His chair, his gaze unapologetically sweeping over me. James must be doing something right. A wife who can cook, and that man looks like he's living the dream. Effort into tonight, he said, his voice quieter now, but then again, I suppose you've always been impressive. I smiled tightly, my smile growing, and I'm glad you're enjoying yourself. He stepped closer, his grin widening, and before I could reply, Mike appeared behind him. His presence was a welcome relief. Brad said, "Why don't you see if Tom and Aaron need a refill?" in a light but firm tone. Brad hesitated for a moment, then nodded and retreated to the living room. The air between us felt charged and electric, as though the entire evening had been building to this moment. Mike stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You look beautiful tonight, Clara." The words were so simple that they sent a shiver down my spine that I was unable to respond, but knew that I was standing on the edge of something and wasn't sure whether I wanted to. "I apologize for that," he said softly. "It's fine," but my voice lacked conviction. "The others weren't blind to it," Brad said, his grin wide but his gaze direct. "If James were here, I'd be telling him how damn lucky he is, but since he's not," he trailed off, leaving the suggestion hanging in the air. "Step back or fall." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. There was something in his tone and the way his eyes held mine that left me breathless. There was something about his presence that made me feel as though gravity was pulling me toward him in ways I couldn't explain. Tom Ever, the smooth one, raised his glass in a mock toast to Clara, saying, "My voice is rich and warm, a rare gem in a world of, let's say, much duller stones." His words hung in the air, their weight landing squarely on me, and I felt my chest tighten, not with discomfort, but with something far more dangerous. I laughed too, a nervous sound that did little to hide the heat rising to my cheeks, but my laughter didn't change the way they were staring at me. For a brief moment, the world seemed to tilt as Aaron, the others, and Mike, who hadn't taken his eyes off me, spoke. Aaron had been silent for the majority of the evening, but then he leaned toward me and said, "I can't stop thinking about you." His words brushed against my skin like a gentle hand. "I'd call her more than a gem. She's the kind of woman you don't forget," Aaron said. Whisper before I could comprehend what was happening. He moved closer, and the distance between us vanished. His eyes were unwavering, and there was no doubt as to whether this was right or wrong. The room seemed to be still, and the air was thick with anticipation. I could feel every detail of how my breath caught, how his hand hovered close to mine, and how the others watched their presence, a current I couldn't ignore. However, when Mike closed the distance, it wasn't his audacity that overcame me. Rather, it was how I allowed it to happen. The world was blurred at the edges, the room's walls fading as I let myself be carried by the kiss, and I felt the shift around us before I saw it. The others were leaning forward, their voices quieter now, but no less charged. Brad said softly, his tone equally amused and curious, "You're holding out on the rest of us." I froze, my breath catching in my throat, but Mike didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled back his eyes a little. It was as if the room itself pulled me forward, drawing me into something I didn't have the strength or will to resist. Tom was the first to follow, leaning closer and brushing his hand against my body deliberately but softly, as though testing the waters. He murmured his words, an echo of thoughts I hadn't dared to say. He searched mine as though asking a question without words, and I didn't stop him. The lines blurred after that. Brad, the bold one, leaned, and last his smile faded into something more serious and intimate, saying, "You're not just beautiful, Clara." Their words, their touches, their nearness. All of it built into a crescendo that I couldn't escape. Mike's hand found mine again, grounding me in the chaos. Aaron's presence was quieter, but no less potent. His gaze was steady and piercing, as if he could see through every defense I built. The night pressed on, each moment blending into the next, the boundaries dissolving completely, and I allowed myself to be carried not by logic or reason, but by the sheer weight of feeling the need to escape the emptiness, the longing to feel alive again when it finally ended the house. unwavering even as the others closed. "And around us, you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but the truth was more complicated than that. I wasn't okay in the way he meant. I was thrilled, scared, exhilarated, and undone. Was quiet again, the sounds of laughter and whispers fading into the silence as the men slowly left, their good eyes lingering in the air like the scent of wine and cologne. Mike stayed a moment longer, his hand brushing against mine one last time as he stood by the door. "Take care, Clara," he said softly, his gaze holding mine with quiet intensity. I couldn't answer, so I sank onto the couch, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I felt everything at once. The excitement, the embarrassment, the excitement, the exhilaration, For 3 days, James returned home with his suitcase rolling in behind him and the slight smell of an airport clinging to his jacket. He was his usual self, calm, polite, and the epitome of composure as he leaned down to kiss my cheek. I smiled and asked him about his trip, my voice light and steady, something I had practiced for the previous 72 hours. Devastation for so long made me feel invisible, empty, and lost, and now I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. Sophie's school lunches were packed with extra care, the house was spotless, and dinner was simmering on the stove. It was the ideal welcome for a husband coming home, but as James stood in the foyer discussing meetings and hotel breakfasts, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was holding my breath, the weight of the previous weekend hanging over me like a phantom, its whispers growing louder with each second. The days that followed unfolded like any other, and I fell into the routines I knew. By heart, I packed Sophie's school bag, made coffee, shared quiet dinners with James, and moved through the house as if nothing had changed. However, underneath, I felt as though I was walking a tight RPP with every step being planned, deliberate, and calculated. James didn't seem to notice, he never did, and it wasn't until Friday, almost a week after his return, that the illusion started to fall apart. I was cleaning the living room while James rummaged through a pile of laundry in them. I was halfway through dusting the coffee table when I heard his voice calling out from upstairs, "Clara." It was a simple question, but something in his tone made my stomach drop. I sat down the rag and walked carefully to the bedroom, even as my heart started racing. James was standing close to the laundry basket, holding something in his hand, a white t-shirt that was crumpled and clearly not his, and he turned it over to examine the faint discoloration on the collar, the fray hem. "Whose shirt is this?" My breath caught, and my mind raced for an answer as every scenario played out in rapid-fire succession. I opened my mouth to speak, but Clara James prompted me again, his brows furrowing. "This isn't mine, and it doesn't look like it would fit you." I forced a thin, shaky laugh. "Oh, that's a prank," and as James blinked, I pretended to be busy folding another shirt from the basket I found in the garage. "I thought it would be amusing to plan it somewhere and see how long it took you to notice last week, but I guess I forgot to finish the words spilled out too quickly." I knew how ridiculous they sounded, but I couldn't stop James from holding up the shirt and studying it with a frown, but I couldn't stop him. "You're going to prank me with someone else's t-shirt," I said, keeping my tone light as I moved to the dresser, arranging socks and neat rows. "You know, something silly to break the monotony?" I could feel his eyes on my back sharp, and he smiled back, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, and I could feel the distance between us more keenly than ever that night as we lay in bed. James fell asleep quickly, breathing slowly and steadily while I stared. I searched, and the silence dragged uncomfortably, so I forced myself to keep moving to act as if the explanation was perfectly normal. Finally, he let out a soft chuckle, hesitant but accepting. "You've always had a strange sense of humor, Clara." The t-shirt was still in the laundry basket, waiting to be folded or thrown away, and the ticking clock served as a silent reminder of the delicate balance I was attempting to maintain. The logical part of me knew that I should have thrown it away as soon as the others left, but the chaos of that night had left me confused, and the thought hadn't occurred to me until it was too late. Now, every look James gave me felt like a question he hadn't yet asked, and every word I said felt like an. As James sipped his coffee and read the paper the following morning, I excused myself to run errands and slipped out of the house with the t-shirt in my purse. The drive to meet Mike was tense, and I gripped the wheel as I repeatedly reenacted the conversation with James. By the time I reached the small park where Mike had suggested we meet, my nerves were jangled. He was waiting by a bench, his expression neutral but alert, and as I approached Clara, he greeted me with a warm butt. I took the shirt out of my bag and held it out to him. Mike's eyebrows went up in surprise, and then he laughed, making a low, amused sound. That explains the frantic message. Didn't think it caused this much trouble, it did, I said sharply, my voice shaking. James found it. I had to come up with some ridiculous story to explain why it was in our house. Mike's expression softened, and he reached out to touch my arm. Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make things harder for you. Pulled my arm away, the tension in my chest tightening, and I realized what I had just said. Mike's smile slowly returned, and I knew that the next time he echoed his voice, it was tinged with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked back to my car, leaving the t-shirt and the weight of my own decisions in his hands. I had always been good at compartmentalizing, putting things neatly in boxes, and tucking away emotions I didn't want to confront, but this time the lid wouldn't stay closed. Every time James looked at me, I felt his weight like a stone pressing against my chest. His questions were straightforward, like, did you remember to pick up Sophie's uniform, and what should we do for dinner? But they felt heavy, each one carrying the unspoken accusation I feared he might one day voice. I tried to avoid his eyes as much as possible, withdrawing into the bustle of everyday life. I made excuses to leave the room when he lingered too long, and I laughed at his jokes, but I didn't let them. I pretended to be asleep with my back to him when he reached for me in the silence of our bed. I didn't know how to face him, especially since the memory of what I had done was still pulsing beneath my skin like a bruise. At first, I ignored the messages from Mike and the others, letting my phone buzz softly on the counter or in my bag, but they persisted and were unrepentant, their words dancing just on the verge of flirtation. Mike, I haven't stopped thinking about you. Brad, we should do it. I stared at Aaron's message for the longest time, the words burning into my mind. I don't regret a thing, do you? It wasn't a question I could answer. Regret implied clarity, a recognition of right and wrong, but my emotions were a tangled mess of guilt, shame, longing, and something else I couldn't name. Sophie noticed the change first. At one point, you were unforgettable, Tom. You were okay. Let me know if you need anything. One night, as I was putting her to bed, I said, no, sweetheart, quickly brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Why would you think that she frowned? She asked, her tiny hands gripping the edge of her blanket. You don't smile as much when you're with him, and you're quiet a lot. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Oh, Sophie, I whispered, leaning down to kiss her forehead. I'm not mad at Daddy. I've just had a lot on my mind. I'm not mad at Daddy, I said, forcing a smile without saying anything you need to. Concern, but as I shut the door to her bedroom that evening, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that she was more perceptive than I wanted to acknowledge. James, on the other hand, was incredibly patient. He didn't ask me questions or demand explanations when I became quiet or distracted, instead remaining the constant presence that had always been helping Sophie with her homework, cleaning the kitchen after supper, and kissing my cheek before he left for work every morning. However, I could sense the questions that were hidden beneath his silence, the way he... One evening after Sophie had gone to bed and James was seated on the couch with his laptop, my phone buzzed again. It was Mike. We need to talk. You can't ignore me forever. I stared at the message, my heart thumping in my chest, my thumb hovering. He watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his hands hesitated when they brushed against mine, as if he were unsure whether I would pull away, and the worst part was I didn't know what he suspected. James's voice cut through the silence, and I flinched, almost dropping the phone. Yes, I said, quickly locking the screen and slipping the phone into my pocket. It was a message from one of the moms in Sophie's class, and he nodded, his attention already back on his screen green, but I could feel his uneasiness, the quiet tension that hung between us like an unspoken truth that night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, I let myself cry silent, desperate tears that soaked my eyes. I could either respond to Mike and keep going down the path I'd started, one that promised excitement but also destruction, or I could break off all contact and try to save what was left of the life I'd built with James and Sophie. I didn't want to lose the rush, the spark of feeling alive again, but I couldn't bear the thought of hurting Sophie or destroying the stability James had worked so hard to create for us. Into the pillow as I struggled with the consequences of my decisions, unsure of what to do and, worse, unsure of whether I wanted to make a decision at all.